Okay, great. We're going to get started now. First off, welcome everyone to the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate. This is our COP27 Debrief event. COP just happened. And so we thought it would be timely for us to convene and have the opportunity to debrief together. My name is Sophia Mirzayee. I'm the Education and Youth Engagement Officer at AKFC. And I will be your event host for today. I hope that's okay with you all. So I don't have too much to talk about other than just flagging a few housekeeping items really quickly. First off, a note to everyone that there will be a Q&A session after the panel discussion. So if at any point, you have a question that arises or if there's a comment you want to make, I encourage you to jot it down and keep it handy and ready to go for when we open up that Q&A part. And for those of you who are joining us on Zoom, we would love for you to participate in the Q&A as well. Feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll make sure to get to as many of the questions as we possibly can in the short time that we have allotted together today. My second housekeeping item, just a very quick friendly reminder that as we are meeting together, sharing space, both in person and online, that you are as mindful and as respectful towards one another as you can be. And with that, I will call up to the podium the Director of Resource Mobilization and Public Engagement, Kiersten, to take it over from here. Thank you.
Good morning if you're joining us here in Ottawa. Good afternoon, good evening if you're joining us from elsewhere in the world. It is my pleasure to welcome you here today to the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate. This building is intended to be a vibrant center for dialogue and diplomacy that deepens international relationships, long-standing and new relationships, fosters learning, disseminates knowledge and information, and presents new opportunities for global collaboration. So what a perfectly fitting topic to gather here today to discuss. I would like to acknowledge that this building is situated on the unceded ancestral lands of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation, who are the traditional guardians of this territory and who have been here since time immemorial. We recognize the first peoples of this land and the treaties that apply to it, and we reaffirm our commitment to continually learning, critically examining our privilege, and supporting our Indigenous neighbors while promoting equality in our work. For centuries, the Algonquin have been coming together at this place where the three rivers meet in a spirit of exchange of goods, of services, but also of relationships and ideas. And so we continue that centuries-old tradition of sharing and exchanging ideas and relationships. The Aga Khan Foundation Canada believes in bringing diverse groups of people together to discuss and deliberate key topics of interest and importance to advance learning, growth, and knowledge among Canadian professionals working in international affairs. So our Learning and Dialogue Initiative is the manifestation of this belief, and you are here today at an event that is part of our Learning and Dialogue Initiative series. Thank you for joining us. It is my pleasure to welcome to the stage Kate Higgins, the CEO of Cooperation Canada, who will be our moderator today. Kate will tell you all about Cooperation Canada when she gets up here, but I think it's worth noting in our spirit of international cooperation that Kate has lived and worked in Australia, Canada, Papua New Guinea, South Africa, Thailand, and Uganda. So we hope she will bring with her the perspectives of many of those experiences when we talk about the global climate crisis today. And she'll be joined on stage by Erin, the director of the IDRC Sustainable Inclusive Economies program. Please join me in welcoming Kate and Erin to the stage.
Well, thank you, Kiersten. Merci beaucoup. Vraiment, ça me fait beaucoup de plaisir d'être ici avec vous ce matin. Merci beaucoup à Aga Khan Foundation of Canada pour l'invitation ce matin. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name's Kate Higgins, and as Kiersten said, I'm the CEO of Cooperation Canada. Cooperation Canada is the umbrella organization, the coalition of Canadian international development and humanitarian organizations working in countries across the world to promote and push for a more sustainable, a fairer, and a more just world. So it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you this morning. We're here to discuss COP27, which recently happened in Egypt, and to really drill down in particular on loss and damage. What is it? What does it mean? How have we come to COP27, where loss and damage was such a critical and important part of that dialogue and that agenda? How will it be financed? Who are the actors? What is Canada's position? And specifically, what role did Pakistan and the Pakistan floods play in really pushing loss and damage onto the agenda? I'm really looking forward to this conversation and moderating it this morning. We have an esteemed lineup of really incredible people who will be speaking with us this morning. So let me take a moment to introduce them. We have Erin Tansey, who is the director of the IDRC Sustainable Inclusive Economies program. The International Development Research Centre is a Canadian treasure. It is something that we should all be extremely proud of, and I'm really thrilled that Erin is here with us this morning. She has a really incredible, interesting career where she has worked for non-governmental organizations, the United Nations, bilateral development programs, with a number of Canadian organizations, including the World University Service of Canada in Malawi, CARE Canada in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the United Nations Refugee Agency in Thailand, Algeria and Ghana, the UN World Food Programme in various countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So lots of really interesting work and thoughts to bring to this conversation this morning. Most recently, Erin worked on a governance program with Global Affairs Canada, together with the South African government. So welcome. We also have joining us virtually today, Nusrat Nasab, who is the CEO of the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat. Nusrat Nasab has been working in the field of development and disaster risk reduction for over 2 decades. Currently, she is the CEO at the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat in Pakistan. Prior to this role, she was on an international assignment and serving as the head of emergency management at the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat. She's also worked as the CEO of Focus Humanitarian Assistance Pakistan, and a number of senior roles in the Aga Khan Development Network. So welcome, Nusrat. We're really thrilled to have you joining us virtually today. And finally, we are joined by Nisha Krishnan, who is the Director for Climate Africa at the World Resources Institute. As the Director for Climate Resilience Africa, Nisha leads a team that is focused on advancing policy and practice on climate action, adaptation, and loss and damage for the World Resources Institute regional team. Previously, she was the Senior Climate Finance Associate at WRI's Climate Resilience Practice. She's done incredible work on climate financing, and she currently serves on the UNFCCC's expert group on action and support under the Warsaw International Mechanism. We have an incredible lineup of speakers, so please join me in giving them a welcome to the conversation this morning. The format for the conversation this morning is I will be asking the panelists some questions. I'm hoping that it's an engaged dialogue, so please feel free to build off each other's comments. Come in if you need to add something. We'll have Q&A at the end. We absolutely want to hear from people that are joining us in person and virtually. So let's get started. Erin, let's start with you. And let's just take a step back. And for those of us that haven't been kind of deeply entrenched in the UN negotiations and in COP27, can you just give us a sense of what is meant by loss and damage in the context of climate change and climate justice?
Sure, thanks Kate. And it's lovely to be here and lovely to talk about this this topic that seems to have just blown up over the last few weeks on international news and even Canadian national news, which is wonderful to get the attention that it so rightly deserves, and it's been a long time coming. I think the first time this was discussed was in 1991, so it's been a long time. But I thought I would just give you a few quotes of what it actually means, the definition of the term loss and damage. So it can refer to permanent loss or irreparable damage caused by the manifestations of climate change, including both severe weather events and also slow onset events, like the rising sea levels, for instance. So it's really a general term that's used by UN negotiators to refer to the consequences of climate change that go beyond what people can cope with or what they can adapt to. Or so when options exist, maybe, but a community doesn't have the resources to access or utilize these. So that's kind of the basic definition of it. And so, as I mentioned before, although it's been on the agenda since 1991, I think it was raised by the Alliance for Small Island States, and you can imagine that rising sea levels is one very large preoccupation of any small island state. But it was actually formally introduced at COP16, which was in 2010. And so since 2013, this agenda has been carried forward through a variety of other mechanisms, including the Warsaw Mechanism on Loss and Damage, but it was finally incorporated into the Paris Agreement in 2015. And I mean, I'll stop there and not go into all the other jargon of where you find it in the Paris Agreement, et cetera. But that gives you a sense of what it is we're talking about.
Great, that really sets the stage for our conversation. Thank you. Nisha, I'd like to turn to you because loss and damage isn't something that just emerged at COP27. As Erin said, it is something that has been moving forward and being discussed and deliberated for several years. So I'd be really interested in hearing from you on why, prior to COP27, was the issue of loss and damage financing so contentious? And what shifted at COP27 to enable the issue of loss and damage to be on the agenda really for the first time?
It's a great question, and thanks also for having me here today. I think some of the things that I'd point to is that one, finance in general under the UNFCCC is a contentious issue. It has been that any sort of issue of loss and damage in particular could point to compensation and liability. And that is really the reason for why a lot of developed countries in particular have been reticent to, I think, discuss this on a UNFCCC sort of agenda, right? And one of the pushbacks, particularly from developing countries and vulnerable countries at this point, is that the Paris Agreement has actually done away with this issue of compensation and liability. So the cover decision within the Paris Agreement actually says that loss and damage is not about compensation and liability. And one of the reasons why just the term compensation and liability is scary, quote unquote, to developed countries is that it could actually open up the door for legal challenges, right, across the world, and a request through judicial means for compensation. So at this point, I would say not just prior to COP27, but at COP27 itself, the issue of actually financing this has been contentious, will continue to be contentious, I think, as we go forward in establishing and figuring out what the requirements of this fund will be and how this fund will actually be financed at some point will continue to be a struggle, I think. And I would say that, honestly, even last year at COP26 in Glasgow, there was actually a push to have loss and damage finance on the agenda and for that to be acknowledged. One of the things that I think we all see and are experiencing is that impacts are here, that losses and damages are already being experienced at accelerating rate, and it is really affecting vulnerable communities and countries across the world, and not just in, say, in Bangladesh or in Pakistan or other places, but also in the U.S., right, and in Canada and other. We do have communities on the front lines who are experiencing loss and damage, and I think that hasn't necessarily really been addressed through our mitigation efforts, through our adaptation efforts. And so given the disappointment from last year at COP26 in Glasgow, we ended up with the Glasgow Dialogue on Loss and Damage, which is basically framed as a 3-year conversation with no real outcome mandated from that dialogue process. And so this year, I think with the G77 and China negotiating group, which is actually a group of over 130 countries, including AOSIS, which Erin mentioned, they really pushed to have this on the agenda and tabled this item actually very early on in the year. And I would say that the latest IPCC report has really put fire or wind under the sails. And then I would say, unfortunately, the sort of tragedy in Pakistan and in Nigeria and at the Horn of Africa really brought to light the fact that loss and damage is here to stay, that we needed to address it, and that there is actually political will to address it. And you can also actually see this in evidence of how the UNFCCC and the Egyptian presidency this year actually appointed 2 facilitators to help push this dialogue forward. And for the first time, actually had a heads of delegation consultation on loss and damage, even before COP27, to really help this forward. So I think there's a lot of political pressure. There was evidence in sort of a real time that this had to happen. And that really pushed, I think, the issue landing on the agenda for the first time. Now, I would say that we probably came out with some of the best outcomes possible, but we weren't sure going into COP whether, even if the agenda item was on the table, if we would come out with something positive. But maybe I'll stop there and hand it back to you. Thanks.
Thank you. That really gives us a sense of the politics of diplomacy and negotiations. And in that context, Erin, could you give us a sense of what Canada's position on loss and damage was in the lead up or prior to COP27?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, at the beginning in the 90s and early 2000s, Canada was also reticent to be involved in this conversation because it was, as Nisha says, about liability and compensation, and that I think was very scary for the government of Canada. But over the last few years, I think Canada has absolutely recognized that that promises that had been made, over the years at various COPs and through UNFCCC discussions weren't being upheld. And so by the time COP27 came around, I mean, Minister Guilbeault, even many months before, was already giving lots of signals that there was very much in support of developing countries, and came out publicly saying that there was a need for a loss and damage fund, standalone fund. So it's been a journey, but Canada, I think, is absolutely behind this new development. Where that will lead to and what happens next, I think the whole world is trying to figure that out. So, yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you. Nusrat, it would be great to bring you into the conversation at this point. Because as I mentioned earlier, Pakistan played a really important role in advocating for loss and damage financing at COP27, in a large part because of the devastating and unprecedented flooding that had occurred in Pakistan recently. So can you describe for us the situation that continues to unfold in Pakistan with regards to the flooding? And what have been some of the major hurdles and opportunities that Pakistan is facing in recovering from these devastating floods?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. And as the other colleagues have mentioned, this time Pakistan or any other country like Pakistan, due to, I would say, climate change or other multi-hazard, I think the frequency and the intensity, we generally say it has increased, but we see it in Pakistan. And this time when it is 2022, I think this is more, devastating. And it says June it started, but in some of the areas where we work, it even started in May with the Glacier Lake outburst. So as a whole, 33 million people affected, which is a huge number, and 48% of them, children. 8 million people displaced. So that is when this huge number has been impacted. So of course the need really comes, not within the country. It has an international level, call. Right now, if I may say, apart from housing is a major sector where it has, a great need. The infrastructure critical, and the service like access to, clean drinking water. And other, like Pakistan being the agriculture, it depends on the agriculture economy and the industry itself. I would say those major sectors that has badly impacted, and the communication and transportation. So there are many districts, let's say 95, that were declared as climate hit districts. So in those areas, although there was already, I would say, from the past, for example, last 2010 floods, and over the years there were localized one. The economy and the country itself was not recovered from then, and this huge, disaster it comes. So looking at, let's say, how the response, or what are the challenges, of course, like when the government and the UN, when they announced towards end of August, and there was this appeal, right now, if we look at the revised, need and damage assessment, it requires 30 billion, USD for the recovery and rehab part. But this time, what we saw different was the water, of course, it has not receded for some areas, but the response, especially the funding part, it was not that encouraging. Even the real response, let's not talk about the recovery and rehab, but even the immediate needs that were not, I think the funds were not enough. So in a way, in some areas, especially the mountainous region, and not only, let's say, the flood itself, but right now, like the winter, the harsh weather, you cannot keep people in tents, right? It's unbearable. And I think Canada, it sees the snow, and how it really, everything comes stand still if we don't have the means to clear the roads and everything, and the energy crisis, the price hike due to high inflation. So it's not only, let's say, the flood, but there are multifold, I would say, other factors which is making it more challenging for the country, and the COVID itself. So due to that, one of the key issue is education. Because many kids could not go to school in terms of because the schools are underwater, access to, areas, it has become a challenge. And then, the health component because of the waterborne disease. So these are the basic needs, I would say, where any humanitarian organization would really feel that I really want to respond, but if there are no resources, you feel really, I would say, helpless. Referring to the opportunity, I think it gives Pakistan, one is referring the subject, like the loss and damage. I would say, like, when it comes to humanitarian response, it seems charity. So this loss and damage, why it's so important, it brings the notion of climate justice. And countries like Pakistan, who are not the, who don't contribute into the GHG, but they are more vulnerable to the effects. So I think it brings on the table that negotiation, and I would say I would call it climate diplomacy. And not only, let's say, from the political aspect, but I think it gives it a regional approach. It gives it a more kind of, a grouping approach of, like, there are many countries like Pakistan who go through the same situation. So I think that on the table, the same issue comes with a different, I would say, aspect. So I really feel that there is an opportunity for countries like Pakistan to make that climate diplomacy more, successful. I think there is a hope that, of course, this fund has been, established, but how it will work, how much, they will keep there, who will pay for it? These are some of the key questions, I would say, around where maybe by the next COP, some of the answer could be, clearly answered. So coming back to your question of the opportunities for Pakistan in particular, I clearly see that there are room for improvement, specifically into the systematic approach of, doing the disaster risk reduction or the climate change adaptation. And it requires some institutional capacity as well. And it requires, as I mentioned, some diplomacy. And the key, part is like how better we can do the planning for be it a land use plan, be it habitat plan, and how that could be used in development, especially in the infrastructure, or be it the urban or rural planning, because we clearly see here those who have been affected, majority of them were poor. So that has put the country, I would say, the challenges that has put the country really backward, because I think people have lost, not only, let's say, their job, their business, their livelihood options. So it really brings many people, almost, I think, 9 million directly to below the poverty line. So I think it's really a challenging situation for the country, and of course, like, that makes it more into, right now, if we have not addressed the immediate need, the recovery needs are beyond, I would say, the reach.
Thank you so much for talking us through the context that you're facing in Pakistan, and just two reflections on that. I think firstly, it makes us reflect on and think about the fact that in the context of disasters like this, there's the immediate aftermath, but then there's the real complexity of redeveloping and rebuilding after such an enormous disaster. The other thing I wanted to mention is I read recently that the estimation is that with the Pakistan flood, that at least 50% of those floods and that flooding was as a result of human activity. And it made me reflect on the language we use around disasters, where we say a natural disaster. And the context that we're in now is that it is not, in fact, just nature. It is more a natural and human-induced disaster. And that really forces us to reflect on the responsibility of humans in bringing such suffering to other humans in the context of disasters like the Pakistan floods. So let's move a little bit to the intricacies of climate diplomacy and negotiations. And Nisha, I'd like to turn back to you. And get your reflections on what the critical issues and hurdles were in relation to negotiating the loss and damage financing mechanism in particular?
Thanks. I also just wanted to say that I think Nusrat hit multiple nails on the head when she was talking about the climate justice issue, as well as sort of this issue of how do you think about the recovery and how do you actually invest in adaptation going forward. But that aside, I mean, going back to how COP27 and the negotiations played out, you know, I think compensation and liability was the biggest hurdle, even within the context over those 2 weeks. I think there was even some reticence, for example. So there's actually two aspects to each COP. One is the discussion under the actual UNFCCC agreement itself, and then there is the party to the Paris Agreement, part of the countries that have signed on to the Paris Agreement. So for example, you could have signed on to the UNFCCC, but you can also have, say, walked out of the Paris Agreement as the US had done and has now re-entered. So one of the things that was actually a hurdle was to make sure that the loss and damage finance agenda item was under both sets of agreements, right? Because you could, for example, potentially have a situation in the future where a country can walk out of the Paris Agreement and then would no longer, if it wasn't under the UNFCCC, would no longer have to pay into the loss and damage fund, for example. So that was another sort of nuance that was happening within the 2 weeks, is whether the loss and damage finance fund, if that was to come out, would actually sit under both agreements. So that's another piece. And then I would say that there was actually quite a lot of reticence. One is that developed countries in particular did not want to create a two-track process because we've already established the Glasgow Dialogue, which from a vulnerable country point of view, including Pakistan, G77 and AOSIS, was just a talk shop. The Glasgow Dialogue is once a year process that happens only in June in the intersessional sessions that happen in Bonn every year, and was not accountable to the COP that happens at the end of the year. And so there was a lot of pushback from developed countries to have a two-track process that didn't speak to each other. But also there was frustration that this process that Glasgow Dialogue had established did not have any teeth and did not have a mandate to do anything other than to speak to each other. So I think that was another sort of hurdle that parties had to get over. I think the other piece it comes down to the fact is that we are, the developed world in particular is in a very tight, and the developing world, I guess, we're all in a very tight fiscal position, right? So economically, how do you actually figure out how to finance these flows? So that was another sort of hurdle, and there's quite a lot of talk, I think, at COP this year around reforming the financial architecture, including the World Bank, the IMF. How do we use those instruments to actually finance more of our climate needs? And so it's kind of all intertwined with that. And so there was also a push there. And I would say at the end of the day, there's also just this acknowledgement that comes with acknowledging loss and damage, is that we've sort of started to realize that we're not doing enough on mitigation and adaptation. And the extent to which we're seeing losses and damages is also because we failed at other parts, right? So I think there's also this feeling of the fact that we need to do more and not knowing how to do that going forward. And last, two other points, sorry. The other piece is that all of these countries have domestic constituencies that they also have to take this back to, right? So for example, the politics in the US, which was one of the stalwarts in the loss and damage conversation at COP this year, is that how do you get Congress here to pass the establishment of another fund, right? So they still have to figure that out. And so that was another piece. And even domestically in the EU, even though parts of the EU, for example, had signed off on establishing this from a climate justice perspective, and had already started giving resources to the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, which is actually a technical assistance facility on loss and damage, there's still sort of the political sort of management that you have to do domestically in actually resourcing this. And with linked to that is the hurdle still remains, as Nusrat pointed out, is how is this actually going to be financed? And is this an empty shell? And I think that was another precedent that developed countries did not want to set. And honestly, I would say even within the G77 and China coalition, which was pushing quite a lot for this fund to be established, there are actual differences, right? The fact that the coalition held together over the 2 weeks despite differences of opinion within the coalition as to whether even a fund needed to be established or whether there were mechanisms outside of the UNFCCC that could be valuable here, is actually really impressive. And, kudos to the Pakistan chair, but also the rest of the countries in hanging together to make sure that this was a joint face that they presented throughout the 2 weeks, despite the varied interests around coal drawdowns, around what are the other concessions they might have to give on other parts of the negotiations, whether that's on the mitigation work program, on adaptation, which was meant to be a sort of a priority this year as well, which didn't get the attention it deserved as well. But I think it was a very complex set of card trading or chess pieces that were happening all at the same time. And so it really, and I would say that the coalition of G77 in China really held back and held their position strongly to make this a success, right, for them. Maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you. So, Erin, if I can turn to you, and if you can build on what Nisha was just talking about from a Canadian perspective. Has Canada's position shifted on the result on the issue of loss and damage as a result of the negotiations, and what can we expect or anticipate in terms of Canada's positioning on loss and damage going forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't speak on behalf of the entire Canadian government, but I can speak on behalf of Crown Corporation, the International Development Research Center, which for whom I am working. And so for those of you that don't know us, I mean, we are part of the sort of Canada's foreign affairs infrastructure, separate from Global Affairs Canada, and we spend more than, I think, 85% of our money in investing in research in the Global South and by Southern institutions. So yeah, over 85% of our money goes to Southern researchers for them to, to be able to figure out their development challenges from their local point of view. So just recently, actually at COP, we were able to announce a new funding, research fund for loss and damage, which I can just give you a little bit more information on here, because I mean everybody could see the writing on the wall that loss and damage is really like, the third pillar for these international climate negotiations. But that I think our two other panelists have said, it's crippled by a controversy, political controversy, and a lack of clarity on basic principles of operation and strategies for financing. So. And it's been very slow, we're still now 30 years later and not much has happened. So because this process has been slow, research investments in the Global South to inform global negotiations has also been limited. Right? So that now we've got to this fantastic stage with COP27 and the agreement there, but now we realize, there's a lack of evidence to support policy development, right? It's not that it's not there, it's just it hasn't been gathered necessarily well enough yet. And there's a lack of clarity on how vulnerable countries can formulate loss and damage policy responses at the national level. So we launched this new research project that specifically focuses on loss and damage to understand and to address the knowledge and capacity gaps of the most vulnerable countries in the Global South, so that they're better able to develop a country-level loss and damage policy and implementation mechanism, which of course will be extremely important as real, concrete discussions start happening over the next few years and over the next decade. And next year, with the global stocktake of the Paris Agreement, which will be talked about at COP28, it's also critical that loss and damage is, of course, addressed with this greater sense of clarity. So the project will support the development of these policy and implementation mechanisms through sort of a three-pronged approach, where they'll do a critical review of documented knowledge and discourse, and then country-level diagnostic studies and collaborative policy actions, and then a series of dialogues and knowledge exchange forums. So some of the countries are Bangladesh, Nepal, Vanuatu, and others, and then it will expand to other that's sort of like the tier 1 countries, but then there'll be tier 2 countries like Senegal and many others, to bring a South-South dialogue around some of the technicalities and some of the evidence that's not there yet, hasn't been gathered yet, so that countries can be in a better position to negotiate at COPs to come.
Well, that's a really fantastic example of the work that IDRC does and why we should
I'll just add,
So please,
sorry.
Please.
I just also, I think it's worth a mention that this work is being done by the International Center for Climate Change and Development. They're based in Bangladesh, but the person that is going to be leading this research is Professor Salim Al-Hook, who is, probably many of you probably heard him on the news. I've heard him being interviewed on CBC several times over the last few weeks. I mean, he's a sort of eminent expert in loss and damage, and was had a big voice at COP as well, and has been pushing for many years for this this loss and damage breakthrough to happen. So I feel very confident that the evidence that is gathered here will be of very high quality and hopefully very useful to those countries that have the most at stake. Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's really fantastic to have his leadership, and I think it's real testament to the amazing work of IDRC. To be able to bring these Southern researchers together to address some of the most pressing challenges that we face in the world. So congratulations on that. Nusrat, if we can turn back to you, what are your thoughts, what are your hopes, what are your dreams around the difference that the availability of loss and damage financing will make in Pakistan, post-floods, for the post-flood long-term recovery that is needed? What are your thoughts on what this loss and damage financing can do for a country like Pakistan?
Thank you. I think that's a great question. I think it can really bring, I would say, a paradigm shift to build systematic resilience to natural hazard or in the development planning, So there are multiple segments of the society, especially women, children, differently able people, poor, rich. So this loss and damage, really, I would say it will address who has lost something or the damage is there. But on the other hand, it will bring a kind of forecast-based or anticipatory, kind of response and recovery in the country, because people will work on more of a scenario-based approach. One is that part. The other one, especially giving the context, I think Pakistan has played a key role in kind of bringing this on the table, and I really wish that Pakistan leads to the conclusion of like what the actual implementation will look like. Because if Pakistan is put on the leadership part in that, I would clearly consider that there are institutional requirements. The capacity needs to be kind of developed, and also as I mentioned about this is a kind of thing which goes beyond, I would say, borders. So that really provides an opportunity for Pakistan to kind of use multi-sector and multi-stakeholder and kind of multi-technical capacities required to bring everybody on the table, and maybe usually like people ask for money, but I think this particular opportunity gives Pakistan to share the talent, the skill in the country, as well as ask for the technical skill required from the international community.
Thank you.
And I really want,
Please.
this to in resilience and development.
Thank you. I think it's been really interesting, and I think I was speaking to some people earlier before we started the session, that there are many people that have been involved in these climate negotiations for decades. And one of the reflections that I think several people have is that when these COPs started, they were very much intergovernmental. There was it was a government-to-government discussion and negotiation. And while that's still the case, COPs, the climate movement, is much more multi-sectoral, much more multidisciplinary in the global conversation and discussion around climate, but also at the negotiations, where it is not just governments that are there. Obviously, governments are negotiating, but we have civil society organizations, we have activists, we have the private sector, we have think tanks like the World Resources Institute. So Nisha, I'd like to turn to you for some of your reflections on this. I think we all agree that climate change, climate justice needs a whole of society approach. And that does not just mean that it's governments that are implicated in this. We do need civil society, we do need activism, we do need the private sector, we do need research, we do need knowledge leaders, we do need universities, we do need schools, we need communities. And so, Nisha, some of your reflections on that, particularly in the context of loss and damage. To what extent do you think that this multi-sectoral engagement in climate justice and in the COP negotiations has pushed issues like loss and damage really to the forefront?
That's a great question. I was going to say, I think, first of all, I think we potentially would not have had loss and damage on the agenda item as much if we didn't have the push from civil society and other actors actually continuing to raise this issue, right? Not just internationally, but also domestically. So I mentioned earlier, domestic constituencies within countries really did lobby their own sort of policymakers to make sure that there was some attention paid to this. And I would say even till the end of COP this year, if it wasn't for the outcry and the continued pressure, I don't think we could have had the success that we did. And that's not to pat ourselves on the back, but I think it is indicative of the fact that if we don't have these lived experiences coming up, if we don't have this evidence coming up and different stories coming out, we don't have that ability to really influence the process as much as possible. So I think in some ways the attention, and I would say even the media and other accountability actors in this, having that force and for us to work together and make this an issue, I think is sort of indicative of how we do need everyone on board here. I'd also say that, you rightly mentioned that, really to shift sort of the way that we think about economics, we think about finance, we do need the rest of the world to come out. And it's been interesting for me as someone who's been part of the COP process for a while, is to look at kind of the call outs and decisions to other institutions and other entities that are actually not under the UNFCCC's ability to influence, right? So if we do call out the World Banks of the world or the regional development banks or other actors, universities, they don't have to report to the UNFCCC, but yet there is that acknowledgement even within the climate movement that without these other actors and without them being named, even if there's no accountability, that this is an important movement, right? And that it gives the right signals to other actors to actually contribute to this. I'd also say, obviously, the UNFCCC and countries have recognized the role of non-state actors, which is why they have the Marrakesh Partnership, which is all about non-state actors. And I'm not sure if any of you had heard about the climate champions, but that whole group is to actually start to galvanize action outside of the sort of country and government process to get businesses to move, to get civil society to really account for their own actions, right? So There, for example, Dan Church8, which is a Danish-based agency, actually has put out their own calculations of their emissions and are putting together reparations and are actually out of their own funds actually sort of implementing projects, right, to address loss and damage from their own pieces. And that's just an example of an NGO doing this. And so there is, I think, this accounting for our own actions and figuring out what role we can play, not just from a research perspective, but also from a practice and advocacy perspective, what we can do to really influence the discussions. And I'd say just because we have a fund established, which doesn't yet have the financing, doesn't yet have the operational structures, there's still a lot to be done in terms of the accountability process, right? And that's the role that I think outside actors, outside of the governmental process, can really play in ensuring that resources do reach the ground. We already see only about $1 of every $10 in climate finance reaching the ground. And so what does that mean for loss and damage finance? How do we hold our own governments accountable if they are to receive loss and damage finance, that it actually gets to people that are need it, and that we don't continue the processes of ignoring communities because they are convenient to ignore, right? So I think that's plenty of things for us to still think about in the context of loss and damage going forward.
Thank you. I would actually like to hear from both Erin and from Nusrat on this around, let's maybe start with you, Erin. You spoke about the work that IDRC is doing, the work that you're launching in the context of loss and damage. But your thoughts on the role of knowledge, the role of research, the role of knowledge institutions and leaders in tackling these big issues that we're facing in the world, like climate change and loss and damage. Just some general reflections on that, because I think there really has been a shift, and we do need to be thinking about how do we bring these different perspectives, these different voices, these different sectors together to address these really critical issues that we're facing.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is just the glaring statistic. I don't have it exactly, but if you look at peer-reviewed journals on climate change, over 75% of those peer-reviewed journals are actually published by northern-based researchers, even though, of course, the effects of climate change are being felt most severely in developing countries. So we have a lot of work to do there to, for lack of a better word, decolonialize the research sort of infrastructure, right? Of course, IDRC tries to do that, but we're a very small, we're a small Canadian organization that gets a parliamentary appropriation every year. But the other piece is, I think, continuing to highlight the need and the importance of Southern voices around these issues at any international fora, right? So, whether it's climate negotiators or young climate activists from Africa, from Asia, they need a seat at that table. Their voices need to be heard. We can't just make the assumption that their concerns are being addressed. We have no idea how they're experiencing these things, and how climate change, loss and damage, floods in Pakistan, etc., how that actually affects and impacts their current life, their future life, etc. So there's a lot of work to do in the knowledge space, we try and look for every opportunity to raise those voices, in the sense of, hey, you're the expert on this, could you please come and speak at this World Bank seminar? If we need to pay a ticket, here you go, so that voice is there. And also, I think, highlighting the need for South-South dialogue, right? Really fostering that kind of learning from each other, and the solidarity, which is obviously there, and you could see that at COP, is also, I think, extremely important. Yeah.
Thank you. Nusrat, I'd like to turn to you on this same question. We're talking about voice, representation, the diversity of perspectives, the role of civil society and knowledge, and actors beyond government in tackling these big challenges like climate change, and in making loss and damage a real reality. Your thoughts on that?
Thank you so much. Because we work mainly with, civil society organization or the community, so I can clearly say that your question particularly, not only on the voice, but let's say the messaging itself. Of course, like climate change, like we have to give the scientific, knowledge and the messaging around that, but the indigenous knowledge, that has a role in here as well, because we talk about climate change as a macro, issue, and the modeling and everything, it comes around a macro level. But I think there are very little, work done at the micro level to really see like the impact on a particular community, how that really, makes people's life more vulnerable. So there are youth who really want to take part, not only, let's say, the knowledge, but there are people who want to bring solutions. So I think we have to adopt that approach of climate, smart solutions, and that is from a localized to, of course, like the international ones. My organization, I can just give you one example, that we are doing a study with the university on the climate change forecasting, and particularly focusing on the mountainous region of the three countries, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Pakistan. I think that will really give us an evidence-based, the kind of approach where we can clearly see what comes next is, and we are better prepared for that together with the communities. Another thing is even with the small, not really a high tech, but let's say we have 88 weather monitoring posts managed by the communities. So that really kind of gives it a leverage that there were 174, for example, events we recorded in the mountainous region of Gilgit-Baltistan and Chitral that impacted 140 villages. And there were villages where, let's say, the part of the village was washed away, but there was not a single life lost. And these are the kind of, I would say, success when you keep the ownership with the local communities, with the civil society, and you bring them together and give them the scientific knowledge. I think then the behavior change can really be very easy when it comes with some evidence. So I think everybody, as everybody mentioned, that every stakeholder has to play a role, be it in academia, be it a youth, or be it, even the people with more wisdom, like aged people. Thank you.
Well, thank you. This has been a really rich conversation and a really important one. And we now will we'd like to hear from you, whether you're here with us in person or you're joining us virtually. So let me hand it back to Sophia, who will let us know how we're going to facilitate the question and answer session.
Thank you, Kate, and panelists. Really enjoying this discussion so far. As somebody who had very minimal understanding of loss and damage, I now feel much more like I have a much more comprehensive understanding of the topic that we're discussing here today. So thank you for all your contributions thus far. I hope you've been jotting down your questions and that they're ready to go. For those of you in person, we do have 2 mics set up in the back there on either side of the room. If you want to pose a question, feel free to go up to the mic and do so. And keep the questions coming from our Zoom participants as well. Please use the chat box to throw your questions in there for our panelists. If you would like your question to be directed to a specific panelist, also mention that in the chat as well. I do have a question to start us off with from Ali, who is a Zoom participant. This is not addressed to anyone in particular, so perhaps we can open it up to everybody. So here's Ali's question. Have countries actually agreed to a formula for compensation for loss and damage claims?
A very good question. Thank you. Who would like to start with that? Maybe we could. Any volunteers?
Maybe.
Nisha, good, great.
Sure.
Let's go.
I was going to say, so there will likely not be a formula ever agreed, I think, on who pays for this, right? So the way that, for example, the Green Climate Fund was established and is running is that there are contributions that are made from donor countries into developed countries in particular into the Green Climate Fund, and then countries can apply, or there will likely be some sort of maybe trigger process. But what has been set up to really address or to design the loss and damage fund is this transitional committee that Nusrat actually kind of also mentioned, which is that this transitional committee over the next year will figure out frameworks for where money can come from, what are the sources of financing, what are potential operational guidelines for this fund. And that's kind of how the GCF was set up. And so I think that's the same process that will take shape over the next year to decide how this fund will be A, financed, but B, how it might operate and how countries might be able to access that. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks. Would anyone else like to add to that, or should we move on? Let's move on. Any questions from people joining us here in the room today? Be bold, be brave. Okay. Another question from our virtual participants.
Yes, our virtual participants have lots to say about this topic, apparently. So this one is from Joanne, and the question is, do you see that there's any chance of fossil fuel extractors being forced to fund loss and damage?
Very good question. Who would like to take this? We just had Nisha, Nusrat, Erin. Anyone like to take this?
I'm going to pass it over to Nusrat.
Well, I can just wish that, it comes, because I think that's the right way to go. But right now, during, the COP, nothing like that was really endorsed. But I can clearly see that it should be, and the civil society and everybody should, ask for it. That's what I can say. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Nisha, I'm sure you were following this pretty closely. Can you talk us through the politics and the context and where things are at? This is a really important question, and one that I think many of us are asking. So your reflections on this.
Sure. So I think there are a couple of things here. One is that you obviously have countries that are fossil fuel extractors, but also you have companies, right? The private sector that does this. And I think there were starting to be discussions around, what are sort of innovative sources of financing, and potentially even countries are thinking, national governments are thinking about this is, are there abilities to tax, for example, windfall profits that companies have had over the last year, particularly given the energy security situation that has been going on since the war in Ukraine. And so I think there will continue to be questions around how do we sort of finance the loss and damage question, but also just our transition to a lower carbon economy from these companies, right? Which is where a lot of the profits lie. And so I think there could be sort of movements to tax that. There's already conversations around how would we get the aviation industry and the shipping industry also to pay into this fund. And so I think these are all sort of instruments and sources of finance that are on the table. I think, as Nusrat mentioned, it is really up to us to lobby for that as well, and to make sure that there is an evidence base that can be used to support this movement. I think the other thing that I guess forgot to mention actually when we were talking about the contentious issues is actually broadening the donor base even within the UNFCCC. So there is quite a push from the EU and the US for countries like China, for example, to pay into this fund, right? And in the end, there was just very vague language about broadening sources of support and no call out specifically to emerging economies that have also polluted in the last decades or so. But I think that is going to become a more contentious issue going forward. So we might also see more sort of conversations around emerging economies having to pay into this fund as well. Stop there.
Yeah, a really interesting point. And I think for those of us that follow these issues, but also follow more broad development conversations around, for example, how are we going to meet the financing gap on the Sustainable Development Goals, it's clear that we do need to have this really multi-sectoral, multi-financed approach to tackling some of these biggest issues, with the private sector absolutely stepping up and filling financing gaps, but also thinking about how the donor landscape is changing and where financing sources are going to come from the donor side.
If I can just add to that, I mean,
please.
I think the whole, on top of all of that, where does all the money come from? We can't get away from talking about debt and the repayment of debt, because it's a complete catch-22. If countries are not able to repay their debt, it becomes a vicious circle. So, I mean, I think there have been discussions about debt for climate swaps that is growing legs and is starting to develop more deeply, and maybe that's an area that as countries' economies and their fiscal space squeezes because they're paying off their debt, there's just no money for anything related to the Sustainable Development Goals, and certainly not for climate change. So if we take that solidarity and climate justice approach, right, away from that compensation and liability approach, I think there's a lot of space to delve deeper into the possibilities of relooking at debt and making it work for developing countries and for the world.
That's a really important point, and something I'm certainly not an expert in, but have been following, is the leadership of Barbados and small island states in the context of debt and debt swapping, and how countries like Barbados and small island developing states can be swapping debt to enable them to have increased access to finance to be able to deal with these really pressing climate-related issues and emergencies that they're facing. Any other questions from the floor? We have a timid audience today. Yes, wonderful, thank you, please.
Thank you for this important discussion, to Aga Khan and the guests. Oops. Yes. There you go. Thanks. Nusrat, I must say first, my heart goes out to Pakistan. I did live there during the last floods, where 20 million people were displaced working with the UN, so it's just heartbreaking to see. So there's so much work to be done. And I was going to ask about civil society participation, but Kate Higgins, you raised that as well. So just in these discussions, I'm wondering if you might have thoughts for Canadians or those who are joining on Zoom as to what individuals here can do to contribute in a meaningful way, if that's lobbying MPs or in whatever way that might be, aside from perhaps supporting financially with organizations working here and abroad during Christmas, but other meaningful ways that might inspire and motivate each of us to take action.
What a wonderful question. Nusrat, do you have some ideas on this? You are based in Pakistan, but you're part of the global Aga Khan Development Network. The Aga Khan Foundation is a really active and important organization in development here in Canada, does amazing work engaging young and every Canadian in the work of development. But some of your reflections on what sort of solidarity and what sort of things do you think Canadians can be doing to be contributing and seeking to tackle these issues that we're facing around climate justice?
Thank you so much for the kind words, and also I think I take this opportunity to thank the Canadians, because they were the first ones, especially when I went to them for the response part. At least there was a positive response, and for sure for the country. Coming to the real question, I think that's really a great gesture. There are many ideas, as I mentioned about, for example, education. So now, because of the technology, I think it also gives a great opportunity if the students want to learn how the Canadian can offer that knowledge. The other one is the Canadians are already doing volunteerism. So especially there are pro bono services that they can provide. And the other thing is, as we are into the recovery and rehabilitation part, and I mentioned certain sectors, especially the health and the infrastructure in particular, how we can share best practices and knowledge, apart from, of course, like the financial funding required.
Thank you. I think that there are, Cooperation Canada has almost 100 members, and we have big members, small members, members based here in Ottawa, members based all across the country, but Canadian organizations that deeply believe in the role that Canada and Canadians can play in working towards a fairer, more just and more sustainable world. And so the Aga Khan Foundation of Canada is a member, but there are several other members. I hope there are several of them joining us virtually too, but I think there are many opportunities for Canadians to engage, whether it's learning about this, engaging in public education initiatives, giving generously where you can to Canadian organizations that are doing incredible work, but also engaging in incredible advocacy initiatives that are happening, which are seeking to really push the Canadian government for bold and brave and progressive leadership. There is so much that we need to do. We understand that the fiscal context is challenging and may continue to be challenging, but organizations that are members of Cooperation Canada, and surely from my perspective at Cooperation Canada, there is much that Canada needs to do to make bold and progressive and life-changing contributions to the people that are really bearing the brunt of climate injustice. And so thank you for that question, and I think there is much as we move into the holiday period for us to reflect on in terms of our individual responsibilities as Canadians. Do we have any other questions from the floor, please?
Hi, can you hear me? So first, thank you so much for the talk. I really learned so much. I have a question mainly for Nusrat, but I think anybody else can answer. And it's about working with the indigenous community for disaster management and preparedness, because I think as Pakistan is being hit by such floods and other parts of the world too, we know that certain areas are vulnerable for climate-induced floods or the other kinds of disasters. But at the same time, let's say if, I don't know, there's 100 villages in a mountainous area in Pakistan that's vulnerable for this kind of disasters, I don't know what we can do, because we can't tell these people, okay, move from these villages to a city and just live there and, abandon your lifestyle. But at the same time, we know that they're very likely to get hit with, similar floods. So what do you do? How do you work with them? And how do you work with them so that they can preserve their culture and their lifestyle and are not forced to do something drastically different, but at the same time, they're also not going to be hit by such major disasters very badly? Yeah, thank you.
Nusrat, over to you to answer that question.
Thank you so much. That's a great question, and you rightly mentioned about the vulnerability aspect. It's not only, let's say, in the mountainous region, as we can clearly see in the coastal area also. So what brings it, the unique thing is, like, we have to live with risk. We can reduce risk, but we cannot eliminate, certain risks. So if we know and if we change our behavior, I think everybody can contribute. Coming to the communities itself, as there are many, you rightly mentioned, many, settlements who are, let's say, which is prone to multiple disasters. There are areas where are limited, safer places to live in. And we are facing it when we are constructing this eco-friendly prefabricated homes for the mountainous communities. So it's becoming very difficult for us to find a safe land to construct that particular home for that. So I think one is the relocation part, as you mentioned, like ask people to relocate to some areas, which is the most challenging aspect, I would say, we are coming across, because it's not that simple. It's not a developed area or even acquiring the land and provision of the basic services. That becomes really a difficult situation. And people, not only, let's say, their livelihood, people have their they call it like, we have this land, it is really it really means to us, because they have an emotional commitment to it that comes from their ancestors, and they have lived there for many years. But the only difference I can see here is the behavior, because maybe the ancestors, they were more not really going to the risky area, but because of the economic opportunity, people build in the let's say river banks or so. So that is something I would say we can learn from the developed countries, and also we can really educate people here. So that's one thing I can clearly say. And then I think the governance part is something where we can combine all the and the knowledge and the best practices and make it happen.
Well, thank you. Please.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, super.
And this is also coming from our Zoom participant. And I think this one is for everyone, so anyone who wants to jump in. How do you reach consensus on any negotiation? Does it need to be unanimous or a special majority? Also, will contributions be voluntary only if there is no mechanism for enforcement?
A very challenging question. Nisha, why don't we turn to you on that?
Sure, I was just starting to actually address it in the chat because I didn't know if we had time. So Ali, thanks for your question. The UNFCCC process is actually consensus-based and has to be unanimous, right? And it's actually one of the few spaces where each country, regardless of your size of your delegation or where you come from, has to be heard, which is why the process is so lengthy, which is why the meetings always run over time at this point. For example, it was meant to close on Friday, it closed on Sunday at, I think, 10 a.m. or something. And it's why, even though progress can be slow under the UNFCCC and it takes time to do these things, it's because every country needs to be heard. And it's one of the few places where that happens. And so it's important as a multilateral process to protect it, especially in a world where the rest of the conversations are being increasingly fragmented. So it has to be unanimous for things to go forward. The second point, part of your question on contributions, I guess at the end of the day, all of the contributions that developed countries make into funds, whether that's a Green Climate Fund or otherwise, are actually voluntary, right? But the issue, the reasons for why we want funds to report to the UNFCCC and be held accountable is that you can actually follow up through mechanisms, right? So, for example, Pakistan can call out Canada for not contributing to the Green Climate Fund or for not meeting its obligations per se, but the amount that is contributed and how often is all voluntary, which is why all of the funds go through replenishment processes that can be held accountable to the UNFCCC. And I think this is why, again, outside actors other than other parties to the UNFCCC are really important, is so that we can actually hold these other actors accountable, right? So we can go through budget documents, we can go through announcements and say, you are potentially repurposing this money from development aid or from other parts of your climate finance. And that's our role, I think, as civil society and participants in this process to hold countries accountable.
Thank you. Well, I think we're at time. It's been a really rich conversation this morning, and one that I have certainly benefited from and learned a lot from. I think we've reflected on how justice is really at the heart of a lot of the conversations we're having, and one of the key drivers for the movement on loss and damage. Thank you for talking us through the intricacies of geopolitics and diplomacy. I certainly learned a lot from all of you on Canada's position, but also how geopolitics is playing out to drive forward the climate negotiations and the work and commitments to loss and damage more specifically. I've really enjoyed thinking through and learning and hearing your reflections on the need for a real multi-sectoral, across society approach to tackling climate change and climate injustice, specifically around loss and damage. And finally, I would like to thank Nusrat specifically for really grounding our conversation in the realities of what all of this means for people in Pakistan who have faced such devastation during these Pakistan floods, and doing everything they can to rebuild their lives after that really devastating event. So thank you for grounding the conversation. Finally, I would like to thank the Aga Khan Foundation of Canada for facilitating this conversation this morning, for sharing this incredible space. Kiersten, when she opened the conversation today, spoke about the importance of dialogue and diplomacy, and how this incredible space we have is to facilitate dialogue and diplomacy on these really critical issues that are facing all of us. So a big thank you for creating this space for us to have this conversation today. Thank you again to our panelists, to Nisha, to Nusrat, and to Erin, for your reflections, your honesty, your intelligence, and for sharing all of that with us this morning. So please join me in thanking them for this incredible conversation.
Thank you, Kate, for your moderation. You've been excellent today. I want to echo Kate's thank yous to all of the panelists, but also to all the audience members, those of you who woke up early to be here at 9 or 9:30 a.m. Thank you for making it. I hope it's been as deeply enriching for all of you as it has been for me to listen in on this dialogue. And to our online participants, thank you all for your questions, for your participation in the chat, and for listening in. I just want to close off by saying, please scan our QR codes, give us some feedback on how this event went. All feedback is welcome. We use feedback to help create more events like this and to enhance your event experience. Also, please follow us on our socials. We're on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram as well. And you can also find us on our website at akfc.ca. Thank you all again very much. It's been a pleasure to have you in our building, in our space, on this important dialogue around the COP27 and the outcomes of COP27. And I hope to see you all again soon at a future AKFC event. There's also tons of refreshments left, so please help yourself before you head out today. Thank you so much.